So today I am going to cover the short and utterly defining chapter of the prophet Jonah of Nineveh in the Old Testament of the Bible. And I cover this because I believe in this short abbreviated amount of words in it, it contains a prayer in chapter 2, Jonah's prayer, that is a prayer that I rely on consistently. It's a prayer that I've read, and since the first time of reading it, it's really stuck with me. It's really struck me as something that we can pray in moments of weakness, in moments of suffering, in moments of transcending suffering, to be thankful for the times that we were given the redemption and the love and forgiveness of our God. We were given that suffering and that tribulation so that we could appreciate the lack of suffering when it arises and when it comes. It's a reminder that the eye for an eye justice presented to us in the Old Testament isn't without and devoid of compassion and love, but it's full of it. And in order to appreciate compassion and love, one must first understand that punishment had to be doled out differently in the past, and that evil is a byproduct of the lack of good, and that understanding the separation of oneself from good and from love, and it's all part of the process of coming closer to the Almighty Good, the God. And if we continue to turn our back on this, even in times of trouble or in times of prosperity, then we will ultimately be lacking something. And so I think the story of Jonah really exemplifies the nature of the compassion that's contained within the Old Testament, the juxtaposition that exists between good and bad, and eye for an eye, and forgiveness and redemption that Christ brings in the New Testament when he establishes the admonishment of the law, so to speak, and the implementation of the new covenant. And so when we talk about Jonah, I like to point out that Jonah, he is attempting to run away from the call of God. He hears the call of God, and in his rash mind, in his quick thinking, in his almost fear of what following the word of God might entail for his life, he tries to escape quickly. The way he escapes is he runs down to the bay in the harbor, he gets on a boat, and he sails off with the fishermen in an attempt to run away from the omnipresent call of God. Now, this is something that shows that following God isn't always an easy thing to do. It's not a cop-out. It's not something you don't turn to God in times of trouble only to seek his redeeming qualities. We can't forget about him in times of prosperity, and that it's a calling that God will give you, and the will of God manifests in your life in a way that you may see obvious. You may see that your calling is to do this, but it seems too heavy. It seems like a heavy-duty calling upon you to do something. And so you feel as if, even metaphorically, you run away from this, whether or not it's in your own conscience, where you know what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and you intentionally and willfully ignore it, or you go and seek solace within something else that's immediately gratifying, that can help you kind of shroud the ultimate calling of God, because it's important to understand that God and following God is not an easy task. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for the half-committed. It's not for those that seek only solace in times of trouble and then turn away in times of prosperity because we don't need God anymore to deliver us. So we're good. We just use God as a crutch in times of need. We don't need to do that. But Jonah's not doing much wrong here. He's just saying to the sailors, essentially on the boat that he's on, when the storm hits, God brings a storm upon the boat. Because he's telling Jonah, look, I know you can't run away from the omnipresence of God. You can't run away from the omnipotence. You can't run away from the calling of God, because he's everywhere and anywhere at all times. And so God basically brings a storm upon the boat. And all of the sailors and everything begin to discuss amongst themselves who's at fault for the bringing of this storm all of a sudden. And of course, Jonah, knowing that he's avoiding the call of God and ignoring the inevitable, he admits the sailors cast lots, as we say, or as they say. The lots happen to fall upon Jonah. However, that's upon his own accord, because he realizes, even in this moment in time, that it's his fault that all this suffering is being brought upon all the people surrounding him. And he understands that that's not okay. And he understands that his willful ignorance and ignoring of the word of God and the calling of God is bringing upon other people suffering. And so he admits willfully to this, and basically Jonah allows himself to be thrown overboard. He acknowledges the fact that he's been ignoring God. And once he's thrown overboard, of course, the Lord his God gives him a giant fish, a whale, something, behemoth, megalodon, I don't really know what it is, That's, of course, if you're interpreting this literally, which I don't know if I do or not. But I do know that either way, it doesn't matter. I think it's important, too, to know that this tale of Jonah of Nineveh is pretty classic in the way that it demonstrates the compassion and forgiveness and redundancy of God. And he says, basically, from inside the fish, Jonah prays a prayer that I recommend, or not recommend, but that I pray consistently now. And I would like to read it to you guys. And it says, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. So this is brilliant. This is really, really brilliant. It's really touching. And I'll tell you kind of what it reminds me of. And it reminds me of the way in which St. Paul speaks in the New Testament to the churches of Corinth. When he speaks to them with loving kindness, but also with overtly apparent dedication and devotion to Christ and the Lord. He speaks with words that almost feel divinely inspired when they say. And the way Jonah speaks to God in this prayer is he doesn't waste much time acknowledging that God has brought him out of things in the past. He says, from the depths of the grave I called for help and you listened to my cry. So he's already going back and giving thanksgiving for the times that he's been delivered from the evil grips of whatever. He's even retroactively applying thanks to something in times of the most trouble. When he's in the belly of a fish, he's still acknowledging God on things he's done for him before. So he's not forgetting of the almighty grace that's been delivered upon him and the redemption that's been given to him in the past. He's not worried about saving himself right then, but he begins by purveying this overt thanks for what he realizes has been delivered from the grips of evil in the past. And so he said, your waves and breakers swept over me. I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. He's telling God in these times that he's fallen away, he's fallen short, but I will look again at your temple. And he said, you brought me up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. He's saying that he's retroactively applying thanks to things that God has done for him in the past in times of present day suffering. This is a brilliant idea, a brilliant concept, something that we could all really gain something from, I think. And essentially, it's this idea that he said, but with a song of thanksgiving, I will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish to vomit him up. And I think that this prayer that Jonah prays is a prayer that we all could pray in times when we feel at least like maybe we've been forgotten. We've been left behind. We've been mistreated. We've been seeking revenge when we should never have been seeking revenge. When we've engaged in things that basically anything you've ever done, no matter if it's happy, bad, good or happy, whatever it is, it's an applicable prayer to a multitude of different facets of life. And it's not that this prayer is magic or anything, but it's that when you pray it, do it contemplatively. Do it with the suffering of Christ on your mind. Do it with the suffering of yourself on your mind. And do it with the realization that your suffering isn't even close to the suffering that's being had by people right now on this very planet. There's like 1 billion people on this planet that would trade their current day situation with yours right now. Just like 1 billion. It's got to be. Or like 500 billion or 1 million or something. There's a lot of people that would trade whatever suffering you're having for theirs right now. I guarantee it would happen. So you're not that bad off. But it doesn't matter. It's not helpful for me to throw you a rope when you're falling off the cliff if the rope doesn't have an anchor at the top. And so just because your suffering may not be on the same level of magnitude as others doesn't reduce it to not suffering. And so God knows that your suffering is just as paramount to you as others are, even if theirs is more increased in magnitude. So don't think that you're forgotten, or don't think that your suffering isn't severe, because it might be. But pray this prayer of Jonah and think about the words that he was uttering when he was ultimately in the belly of a fish with no hope in the present moment. Do that, and I think that it'll help you out a lot. And I think it's worth doing. Sorry, I had written this thing a while back about Jonah. It's like a 20-page paper, but I was trying to figure out some of the parts of it. Oh, yeah, and basically one of the things I had written was this concept of prayer, metaphysically, is one of the purest and most ancient mechanisms we as humans can engage in to communicate with the divine. So it serves as a nice reminder to always place reverence in our words as they are all heard, especially when we pray. And I mean to say that because the metaphysical act of tossing up words to this divine ultimate good, the idea of relinquishing this to something above you, is so critical and so needed and so helpful in times of really any time. Thanksgiving, even in times of Thanksgiving, it's important to metaphysically connect in a way that you can't do otherwise outside of this contemplative form of prayer, this idea of communicating. And so what I want to also relay is there's this idea in atheistic circles, at least I think, and I can't blame anybody for it. It's an idea that faith is this idea of relinquishing fact, truth, logic, and coherence of thought, basically, to a imaginary friend or something. And that's not what faith really is. Everybody has faith in something. As an atheist, I believe I had more faith in science than I even had. I had the most faith when I was an atheist. I had more faith than I do now as a practicing Christian, because I was putting my faith in something. When I woke up in the morning, I had faith the night before that I would wake up and go and engage in some activity that day. So who was I giving that faith to? I was placing this hope and this enduring faith in nothing. I was still, but I had faith that somehow this perfect universe, this fine-tuned amalgamation of beauty and miraculousness and the concept of our existence, I was putting faith that it randomly occurred. I had more faith in mathematics and science to explain the workings of the universe. It's barely explained. And I had more faith in the sun would rise, but I couldn't tell you why it would rise. I had faith. I had more faith than I do now in something. And it wasn't like faith can be parallel to that of relinquishing science, logic, and history and the ability of coherent thought up to nothing. It's not that. Faith is, you're always utilizing a faithful approach to life in some way or another. And so when we see this metaphysical connection of Jonah to God in the time of suffering, you're seeing unending, unrelenting, and undying faith being placed in what is ultimately good. It's love, beauty, whatever you hold as the ultimate good, this tantamount element of life that promotes you to get up in the morning. Why are you getting up? Well, it's because of the good. It's because of whatever you're striving for that you've placed inherent value upon that you can't necessarily reach just yet. It's the top of Maslow's pyramid of actualization. And you're faithfully engaging in a relationship with that metaphysically through the act of prayer. And I think that it's important to understand the importance and the idea of prayer is this communication, not necessarily with this invisible man in the sky, but with whatever it is that you hold paramount to existence. It's whatever you hold as your logos to get up and do things. Whatever the ultimate mover of all movements is, you're placing some sort of faith in that, just like if you were an atheist placing faith in a physicist to tell you what string theory is and combine particle physics with general relativity and create the grand unified theory. You have faith that there's a meaning for that. Well, this is the same idea. And I think it's important to hold that in reverence. And on top of that, Jonah informs the people of Nineveh, once being relinquished by the fish, that due to the dismay of God, the city shall be overturned. And see, this is the point where I always stopped and said, well, of course, here we go again. We've got an angry, violent God. It's juxtaposed harshly against the promise of unconditional love that's given to us by Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And therefore, boom, Bible's bad. Bible's dumb. The God's not loving. He just wants to tear up the city. Okay, I was out of it. Boom, moved on. Not a Christian. Okay, so now I see it as not that it's irreconcilable with the New Testament, but if you're properly appreciating the narrative structure that this tale encapsulates, is a divine and vivid display of mercy on both the individual and the collective group. As the Ninevites take up collective collective deeds of sensory deprivation and renouncing of earthly pleasures, God looks upon them with much favor, deciding ultimately to spare the fire and brimstone in an act of undeserved compassion shown upon the Ninevites as they were turning away from God prior. So God once again relinquishes his punishment from these people because they turn themselves away from what they were doing, and they unendingly appreciate the words of Jonah, and they follow them with all their might. And so when doing that, God sees that favorably. God sees that they're crying. God sees the effort. God sees the motivation. And he turns away from punishment. And he goes and he pursues this group of Ninevites despite their undeservingness. And even in the wake of such miraculous act of forgiveness, Jonah finds himself once more in a state of dissonance with God. Quickly, it seems, Jonah's faith that existed in the belly of the whale has been found absent and once again evolved into those primitive, terrible emotions of anger, jealousy, and pride. And we see this a lot. And it appears Jonah is ridden with displeasure at the compassion of God. Like, Jonah decides that, he doesn't think that it's okay that God's given this compassion to the Ninevites, despite how he ran away from God's call just recently. So once again, does he deserve another act of compassion from God after God delivered him from the whale and gave him the whale in the first place? Well, maybe not, but that would be very compassionate to once again forgive Jonah for his misdeeds. And we see that very thing occur. And so, but what seems aptly looked at as an expression of Jonah's annoyance with having hurried so quickly from his home, I think that this is a critical part too, is if you read the scriptures, there's a commentary in this Bible I have, and I think it's wrong. It's a wrong interpretation, but basically Jonah seems to be mostly annoyed with the fact that he's being sent away from his house whenever God was going to forgive the Ninevites anyways. He basically is telling God, well, you're omnipotent. Why would you send me all the way from my home to a place to only revoke the anger and revoke the punishment? Therefore, I never had to even go and tell these people. So he's mad that he had to be a little inconvenienced at the will of God. Sometimes God doesn't care what your plans are. Sometimes he doesn't really give a shit what you're doing. He more or less is going to already know, but you have to go and learn these things to know that you shouldn't have done them. Sometimes, just like when he sent it. Okay, I'm going to get this theologically inaccurate, but I think this message still stays. Is it Abraham that brought Isaac up the mountain? Whoever brought Isaac up the mountain and was going to murder him and give him to God, God sends him all the way up the mountain, and then God decides not to let him sacrifice Isaac any longer. But he had to go up the mountain to do God's will first. But it wasn't a waste of time that he brought Isaac to the top of the mountain. But it was the overall motif of sacrificing something with the peril of yourself for the love of God in moments of strife, and then showing him that, you know what, just because you heeded my call, you did what I said, you chased the ultimate good, this was a test of that faith. Just like we test God all the time, it's not unfair for him to test us. We test him all the time. We say, well, God, why do you do all of this? Why is there all of this suffering? Okay, well, how come you can't just go do something? You can't go up the mountain without bitching about how the fact that you had to walk up the mountain. Sometimes you're going to test God, he's going to test you. There's not an inconvenience there, but it sometimes feels as if it is, but it may not be. Recently, I went to Chicago for no reason. I felt like I was supposed to go to Chicago. Granted, was this a call from God? Who knows? Was this me being kind of crazy? Possibly. Who knows? I was doing what I thought was right. I was doing what I felt was I had a connection to go do. When I got there, I felt completely and utterly as if I shouldn't be there after a week or two, and so I came back. I don't necessarily know that this was in any way a parallel to what's a call from God or a misinterpretation on my own accord as to what my future may hold. Either way, regardless, I don't look back upon that experience as a waste of time. I met some amazing people. I learned some amazing things and went to some amazing churches. And then I felt an overwhelming urge to come home because of the violence, the anger, the absolute disrepair that the city of Chicago was in. There's roving gangs of psychopaths that are going around stealing people's drugs and stuff. But I don't regret stealing people's drugs, probably, but also stealing their money. Anyways, and so Jonah's disappointed for that reason. And it's a further conviction of mine that Jonah is an example of someone who needs to heed the call of Jesus in Matthew to pick up his cross and go on. And that understanding that dragging the remnants of unresolved anger in our wake only contributes to rising anger that is uncontrollable, solely because we are all sinners and symbolically we're all eating from the apple at the same time. And so what Jonah's doing is ignoring the heat of God, but I think at this point he's holding on to revenge against the Ninevites, because Jonah is trying to parallel the suffering of himself in the whale to that of the Ninevites. And he's saying, well, I didn't do something on the same magnitude of disobedience to God as the Ninevites, so it's just not fair that they don't get punished in the same magnitude as me. So I want them to be punished for what they did because I was punished. So he's holding on to a revenge, a spiteful look into the past to try to reinvoke God's anger against the Ninevites to balance the tables, so to speak. And that's not how any of this works. That's an interruption, so to speak, of the will of God. You don't get to hold revenge. You don't get to be angry. You don't get to do these things all the time. In fact, you're going to. I do them all the time. All the time I'm revengeful. All the time. I hate it. Stupid. But we're all sinners. We're all eating from the apple, like I said. And the following action of this great tale will clearly teach us the dangers of desire for revenge and how even in the blinding light of God's graciousness showing upon the Ninevites, Jonah still calls God down. And Jonah he's just a human. He's suffering to the will and the condemnation of these negative emotions that we happen to find ourselves just downtrodden by. And I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the intenseness of negative emotion and how holding on to negative emotion is so much more difficult than relinquishing it. Have you ever thought about when you're angry and how much effort it requires to stay angry? What do you have to do to stay angry? Explain that to yourself sometimes. Look at it metacognitively and look at that. To stay angry, you have to consistently reinvoke why you're angry. So if I'm angry at Bob for something and I want to stay angry at Bob, I have to constantly remind myself of why I should be. It's an effort. It's an active effort that expends energy and caloric value in your body and ATP, which we love ATP. We're thank God for mitochondria. And we thank God for the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP in the mitochondria because we really do love that part of the body. It's really cool. And so don't waste ATP on negative emotion. Store up ATP and use it to go and save the world. So God uses the following action, like I was saying, and it can be overtly cloud our appreciation for his creation, which is personified in Jonah. His anger is not really worthwhile of holding on to. And so I think that it's important to understand that. And amidst this tantrum of spite, Jonah once more runs in this case on foot, away from the will of God, as if it were possible anyways. Upon Jonah's arrival, a vine of solace from the elements is once more gratuitously extended to protect Jonah. And so to continue that, upon Jonah's arrival, a vine of solace from the elements is once more gratuitously extended to protect Jonah as he sits in anger. Just as God provided the safety of the fish, once more, out of the undeserved compassion comes to the aid of Jonah, this time without his knowing initially. As the dawn approaches, the writings indicate that God had sent a worm to chew through the vine, removing Jonah's shelter. Now think of this. Jonah had been given shelter. He had been given a second act of compassion, much like the fish that was given to Jonah to save him from the whale, to save him from drowning, essentially. And he sent up that prayer that we talked about being so paramount to my way of interpreting theology moving forward. And God takes away the shelter that's so generously provided to him. And he said, this seeming to Jonah to be his, once again, last straw of existence. Basically, he was in an existentialist dread at this point. He cries out, it would be a better world without his existence. Now, the ensuing question from God to Jonah is one that really does strike me as really, really critical and very, very important. And he says, do you have a right to be angry? I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. And do you really have a right to be angry? No. Think about anger, where the root of it is. It sometimes comes from jealousy. It sometimes comes from greed. It sometimes comes from spite. But the manifestation of anger is a secondary emotion that arises from this feeling prior to emotion, evolving from a feeling of one of those primitive, archaic emotions that's not very good. And so think about that. And then God so eloquently phrases this question in order to capture the paradoxical nature of the perpetual worries that cloud Jonah's ability to rely with valiant faith upon the rock that is the unending virtue of the Father. And that's something I wrote, and I read it too quickly. But what I mean is that these emotions, the more you adhere to them, the more you practice them, the more you refine these negative emotions, all they do is cloud your ability to really see through the veil that is the love of God, that is the love of the Father, that is the unending compassion of Christ. You can't see that whenever you're constantly reminding your brain of how to stay angry. And like I said, that's an active pursuit. It's an active evaluation of emotional state of being that is only compounded further if you focus on it. And then you can't even see the actual gold at the end of the rainbow. And so Jonah is allowing the villainous ego, the ego inside of him that thinks he is actually a self that matters. You're not. And so what matters is helping others. But secondary to that, he allows his mind to take full control over everything. And further relying on God's existential quandary, Jonah confirms his tightly held idea that it is being hardened towards the vine, for it is now dead and can no longer provide him the comfort of the shelter. So once again, Jonah's unappreciative he's more worried about his own solitude, his own solace, his own safety amongst suffering underneath the vine than he's even worried about others. What about the Ninevites? God says to him. What about these 100,000 Ninevites that don't know their left arm from a hole in the ground, who are unintentionally disobeying me? So God shows his compassion once more to those that don't worship him. Those that say you have a group of people in India, they're Hindu, and there's a billion people there. Are they going to go to hell? I don't know all that. Who knows? If you say you know that, you're probably a liar. So the idea is that God even says to him, he continues to say that, how could you possibly show so much dread over the depth of your vine without having planted its seed nor watered its vine? But simultaneously overlook the 100,000 Ninevites that simply do not know their own hand from the moon. So to me, it's like this. It's say that there's one way to Christ, as is said in the chosen Gospels. If that is the case, to tell me that people in India, because they practice and worship Hinduism, are going to hell forever makes no sense, because it would simply be that some of them weren't exposed to Christ in the way that we were. They weren't born geographically in a location that generally promotes this type of thought and philosophy on life. So they didn't get to meet Christ. Okay. So God says that if you don't know your whole hand from the moon, then how could he punish you? So that, to me, it's easier to reconcile and justify this idea of how could such loving, kind, generous, scientifically advanced people in India who practice this religion be going to hell? Well, it's because they're not. Okay? And it's because God doesn't do that to people who don't know their hand from the moon. So it's because they may, if anything, it's not that they don't know their hand from the moon, it's that maybe they don't know the truth, but they weren't given the chance to. And it wouldn't be fair if we let them go to hell for something they didn't even know, because they were born geographically remote location that happened to not be exposed to the same cultural influences as we have over here. And so the Ninevites are the same thing. They don't know the loving of God. They don't know Christ. They don't know the Father. And so they're practicing their own idolatries. But God doesn't send them to hell. He redeems them in an act of ultimate fortuitous passion. And so it's critical to understand that this is more important than your own house and your own vine protecting you. It's that, where were you when everyone else suffered? Where were you when I was doing the work to put the stars in the sky? Where were you when I separated the firmament from the sky and the waters from the water? Where were you? You weren't there. So to try to ask these questions is arrogant, conceited, and not okay. You don't know, and it's okay. Sometimes you have to relinquish knowing to know more. Unknowing is the ultimate source of knowing. That's philosophical too, I know. And in the sentences of this wondrous tale, God closes with a divinely interrogative statement. Should I not be concerned about that great city? And he's basically saying, Jonah, explain to me why you're more important. Why is your vine more important? Tell me. He can't. Just be thankful. And that's all I have for today.